Yes, good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. My name is Michael Kuelker, and since it's 10 minutes that I get, let me get to the point. My point is twofold. One, that this represents a new civil rights movement. Two, and interrelated with this, alternative media play a profoundly important role in articulating and even shaping the movement. I had no idea that there would be this many people, and we're going to have some Q&A and observations from you in just a few minutes. So thank you for staying here. Thank you for being here. I had no idea whatsoever that more than 100 people would show. What's being distributed is a 8-page booklet that I made that gives a short overview of this as a civil rights subject. And I encourage you to think about this and frame the subject in terms of civil rights, because that's really what it is. And again, with that, media portrayals are very important. And I'm here to tell you that having been transfixed by Ferguson, not only in the first 10 days, but since then, the role of independent media has been extremely profound. But first of all, what are civil rights? These are the basic rights that we have. And this, the right to life and the right to safety are the rights from which all others flow. And this is not a time to get into too much history because it is 10 minutes that we get. But we have a number of other rights articulated in our Constitution and Bill of Rights, and we are a country that seeks to have equal rights and justice under the law, equal rights and justice for everyone. And it's been a long road to get there. And one of the precepts about studying civil rights is that when civil rights achievements are made, it's never via a straight line or a narrow, straight-looking road, if you will. And we can study this in terms of history, and we can look at a historical timeline, but a timeline is not history. A timeline is just that. It's linear. And so if we look at Ferguson as a civil rights issue, we're going to see a lot of things, from strides forward in the direction of equal rights and justice for everyone under the law. And we're going to see some missteps, some sidesteps, a lot of things. It's going to be messy looking in actual fact. And one of the interesting things about this subject as a civil rights subject is suggested to you in the last 2 or 3 pages, because this has been called a leaderless movement. It is not top-down management wherein we have a leader like Dr. King 45 and more years ago, leading the movement. And yes, there are some national figures who've come in, Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, and a few others, but they're not the ones leading this movement. One of the most fascinating dimensions of this thing is that we have new and younger leadership who are taking charge and leading the way towards civil rights. And that includes a lot of civil rights demonstrations. It has included looting. That's not actually a civil rights demonstration itself, but that's just one dimension of a much, much larger series of types of response that we've seen. And the new leadership is using and relying upon some of the alternative media. Antonio French has a very active Twitter account. He's an alderman in Ferguson. And if you don't know Antonio French, please look him up, because he's really a hero. And he's one of those people who went out on the front lines trying to talk people down, take your anger and direct it some other kind of way, not through destruction. Antonio French is just one of many people whose Twitter accounts are alive with really essential information. And this handout that I've distributed, I'm sorry that everybody doesn't have one, tries to outline some of the civil rights issues. After the 9th of August, we've seen a lot of response and counter-response by authorities. And among the civil rights issues that we have to deal with as thinking people is, what kind of policing do we want in our communities? Because the militarized response that next week after the original incident on August 9th has attracted international attention. We saw tanks, we saw SWAT teams, we saw snipers aiming at unarmed, peaceful protesters. And there was a media dimension to this that was spectacular. It was spectacle. And that's what, especially that first 8 or 10 days did. It aroused all kinds of very deep feeling things in us. And depending on your point of view, what was aroused? Anger, hate, fascination. Maybe we felt energized. It probably covers the entire spectrum of responses. And it is frightening, because among the realities of this situation in the first 10 days were outside agitators. When the subject of exploitation comes up, I would probably point to other examples beyond t-shirts. I think it was exploited for the anarchists to come in and use that opportunity to foment more anarchy, or for the Communist Party out of Chicago to come down and try to cause more havoc. When we understand things in the language of civil rights, we're not just talking about law and media, we're talking about all kinds of things. That's why I'm glad that this is an interdisciplinary panel, because we do need to know more about sociology, psychology, political science, and especially history. Because what we're seeing is a set of power relations and call and response, if you will. And one of the interesting things for me in terms of observing this and participating in this too is the variety of responses towards civil rights. Because we did see some really bad examples of looting. And I do think we should focus to some extent on looting. I think we can learn from bad behavior. After all, I teach Nazism in my Holocaust class, and I don't teach Nazism like be like this, but we need to understand that as a phenomenon. But that was just one variety of the black experience and a whole rainbow set of responses. I'm carefully watching the time too. So in addition to the militarized policing, we do need to be aware of freedom of the press and freedom of speech. We're getting down to the essence. When we study civil rights, we're getting down to exactly what type of protest in the street is allowable under law in this country. Can you stand in a public space and demonstrate? And up until last Monday, the answer was no. If you check on page 3 of my handout, if you have one, there was something called the 5-second rule, or AKA keep it moving. Demonstrators in Ferguson were not allowed to stand in a public space. And we're not talking about people who were necessarily blocking the access of traffic or anything else. Simply standing on the sidewalk. Are you allowed to do that? The answer was no. It was inconsistent in its application, but the answer was no. How about that for freedom of assembly? So we're getting down to the throbbing heartbeat of this subject when we look at this in terms of civil rights. And as I noted on page 3, just last Monday, a federal judge ruled that police in Ferguson would not be allowed to say, no, you can't stand there, keep it moving. Because what does keep it moving do? It makes people who can't keep it moving stand down. So the older people, or the people with any kind of a limp or whatever might keep them from moving around the whole time that they'd like to demonstrate. That's an essential right, our right to disagree and to express ourselves peaceably. And in addition, civil rights demonstrations, when we study history, are almost never popular. They do arouse deep feelings among us, because it is disturbing to see a mass of people demanding change, particularly if we're not part of that original group. That is a disturbing kind of reality. And so I've quoted Dr. King on page 4 of the handout when he was asked in the mid-1960s on Meet the Press, aren't you doing more harm than good? Because polls have shown that people don't like this kind of activity. And his response was very eloquent. The demonstrations themselves don't change the reality. They won't change law. They are what they are. They're to call attention and to awaken conscience. Now, some of that will have a blowback effect. Some of those demonstrations will be more successful. And among the more successful ones, I think, was the one just last Saturday night at the St. Louis Symphony, where we saw not people saying no justice, no peace. At Powell Symphony Hall, they sang a requiem for Mike Brown. In other words, they entered into this space to demonstrate, but they used the language of that space in order to make their point. And they sang beautifully. If you have not seen the video, watch the video. Because the news accounts, I've noticed, have taken kind of a split. Certain news accounts will call attention to interruption of the symphony. And it takes a while to get into the article to find out that they were singing a requiem for Mike Brown. Whereas some of the more positive media portrayals call attention to this as a requiem. It's a different kind of response. And then some people would unfurl banners from the balcony, flew out paper hearts. And if I can bring up the paper heart. Yeah, okay, it says requiem for Mike Brown. I'm sorry that that's not bigger. But that's, yeah, I'm coming out to my time slide anyway. That's a form of demonstration to awaken conscience. And I think that's part of the discussion that we need to have, because alternative media are vitally important. One last example. When we talk about advocacy media, I'd like to give you what I think is one of the most amazing examples of this whole situation. The St. Louis American is a weekly black newspaper. Its managing editor is Chris King, a white man, by the way. Chris King was on the front line, but not physically. He was at his home with a variety of media in front of him, and because of the clout in the community that the publisher of the St. Louis American has, he also had access to power. And so there were a lot of outside agitators as part of that Ferguson demonstration in the first 10 days. And he had information being fed to him that he was filtering, and he had a webcam which allowed him, as many of us, to watch what was actually happening at a particular place and time. This kind of thing was never shown on corporate media news. But Chris King, getting information, seeing somebody who's out, he believed was outside the community, was able to text somebody in the police force, high ranking, and to say, look at the guy with the white bullhorn and the red ball cap. He, we think, is dangerous. And that shifts the power relations, because really what we're talking about at the essence are power relations. And we're seeing through alternative media a kind of decentering of the traditional forms of power. And yes, we have to filter a lot when there's Twitter rumors and so forth, but between Twitter and other media, the webcams that allow us to see what's actually happening from peaceable protesters, many of whom came out during the day, as opposed to in the evening with the more rowdy protesters. In each case, what we find is a new kind of narrative. What you see depends upon where you stand. That's a Caribbean proverb that I've picked up. What you see depends upon where you stand. So media analysis and civil rights language and concepts and history, that's where I stand, and that's what I'm encouraging you to do as well. Thank you.